Good morning. My name is Jennifer Turner, and I direct the China Environment Forum here at the Wilson Center. And I'm really happy to welcome you to our meeting today called It's Not Easy Being Green, Obstacles for Clean Energy in the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. So I want to also note before we start that this meeting is co-sponsored by Asia Program. Michael Kugelman, who's the assistant director there, is also one of our panelists, and he can tell you more about his project when you go live there, Michael. You just hold on for a few minutes, okay? So let's get rolling here on our nice webinar. So launched in 2015 as a flagship Belt and Road Initiative project, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor aims to ramp up infrastructure development in Pakistan. And a major priority has been power generation, and a lot of that has been coal. So this panel, as the title implied, is going to be looking into some of the roadblocks to green investment in CPEC. We're going to start out with Atika Rehman and Beth Walker from China Dialogue. Atika is going to start off giving us kind of CPEC at a glance. What is it? Where's it going? And then Beth will pick up the conversation talking about the trends of China's carbon-intensive energy investments in CPEC and the environmental impact. Then we're going to move on to Wang Yan, who's a freelance writer focusing on climate, energy, and sustainable development. She used to be a campaigner for Greenpeace. She's going to draw on her field experience in Pakistan, looking into coal-fired power, and discuss the obstacles and opportunities for clean energy investment in CPEC. So looking a little bit both on the Pakistan and the China side. And our closing pitcher today will be Michael Kugelman. He's the Wilson Center Senior Associate for South Asia and Asia Program Deputy Director. And he's going to discuss kind of the broader energy security considerations for Pakistan's and some of the political dynamics around CPEC. So I just like getting right in gear, and I just want to get us started here on this webinar. I want to thank all of you for tuning in today. If you are live, please do look on the webinar page down below the screen. There's Wilson Center CEF Twitter, and there's also an email for ruelee@wilsoncenter.org that you can submit questions anytime during the presentations, because these folks are going to give some nice succinct storytelling today, and then you can ask questions. Okay, I will mute myself, and I'm going to pass things over to Atika. You can share your screen, and we're off and running.
Thank you, Jennifer. I'm going to just go ahead and share my screen. And is that okay?
Yep, looks good.
Sure, sorry, just a second. Yes. Okay, so very quickly, hi everyone, I'm Atika Rehman. I'm the deputy editor at The Third Pole. I've been a journalist for over a decade in Pakistan till I moved to the UK last year. I'm also the UK correspondent for Dawn, which is a major English language newspaper in Pakistan. My reporting largely focuses on current affairs, human rights issues, security, and politics. So to kick off the presentation, I think it's important to look at what CPEC entails very quickly. We're looking at the flagship project of China's ambitious Belt and Road Initiative. This was formalized in 2015 between President Xi Jinping and former Pakistani Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif. It's a $46 billion investment in Pakistan's transport network, ports, energy sector, industries, and it entails 23 energy projects, about 7 major road and rail networks, 9 special economic zones, which we call SEZs, and an expanded functional Gwadar port. From Pakistan's perspective, CPEC will boost industrialization. The authorities hope that it'll create millions of jobs and spur economic growth. The Pakistani military also sees CPEC as forging closer ties with China as an added advantage to counter India. CPEC provides a platform for stronger influence in the region. The corridor is also intended to shorten trade routes for China into Central Asia and Europe. So if we look at how much CPEC has achieved in the last 5 years, you'll see that progress has largely been made on the early harvest projects, which are the energy projects. These include coal-fired power stations, which my colleague Beth Walker will address a little later. Aside from one road project, most of the transport links are not yet operational. The major railway line, which is the ML1, it's about a $6 or $7 billion project, is yet to find a financer. Construction is yet to begin on the special economic zones, and this specific aspect of the corridor is still in the land acquisition and procurement phases. Gwadar Port, which is another landmark project, which includes the construction of an expressway, an airport, breakwaters, and berthing areas, among other things, is also largely incomplete. Now, when we come to talking about the transparency and information and how they have changed in the last few years, there's nothing very positive to report, especially regarding environmental impact. Officials continue to be pretty defensive about CPEC projects. And even though each project has to have an environmental impact assessment, both the previous and the current governments are not forthcoming about such information. So I'll take you through some of the reporting we've done at China Dialogue and the Third Pole with regards to CPEC. Some quick intros here as well. China Dialogue is a bilingual website, and it covers environmental impact and climate with a special focus on China. The Third Pole, which is where I work, is its sister publication, and it covers climate change and environmental degradation in the Hindu Kush Himalayas. I'll now quickly take you through some of the reporting we've done on CPEC, and hopefully you'll find that useful. So in our reporting, we've evaluated whether the economic benefits of large-scale infrastructure projects outweigh the social and environmental costs in the long term. We've also highlighted concerns about exploitation, such as illegal natural resource extraction, environmental pollution, and human rights abuses. Our reporting also touches on the possibility of abuse of authority, which experts say will be difficult to prevent without third-party oversight to ensure the projects are environmentally and socially sustainable. Now, here you're looking at one of our early reports on CPEC coal projects, in which energy experts said the government's reliance on fossil fuels is at 60% and growing. This year, in 2020, we highlighted in another report the National Commission for Human Rights on the Thar project, which said that there are huge social and cultural costs that no money can ever compensate for. Lastly, I'll come to our most recent report, which we published just a few months ago. In this, we looked at the major challenges for CPEC and the reasons behind the slowdown over the last 2 years. This article talked about factors such as a change in government, a tussle between the federal government and the provinces about fair distribution of resources, the Pakistan military's growing involvement in the project, all of which will shape the future of the corridor. In this, we concluded that the new CPEC authority, that I think we might have some time to talk about later, at the moment it's having some legal trouble, but this authority aims to centralize decision-making and take autonomy away from the provinces. This entire exercise might make the future of CPEC and its environmental consequences even more opaque. Thank you very much for listening. Over to you, Beth.
Thanks so much, Atika. And so Beth, you can pull up your slides, and you can give a little short intro to yourself as well. I mean, you wear a couple hats at China Dialogue and Third Pole.
Yeah, so my name's Beth Walker, and I'm UK editor at the Third Pole, and also an editor at China Dialogue. And I've been covering China's kind of overseas impact for many years now, based from South Asia, Myanmar, and China. Let's get back to the beginning. So I'm going to kind of jump in and get to the kind of nitty-gritty of the energy projects under CPEC. And as Atika was saying, this is where the real progress has been made under CPEC. According to the kind of latest figures, there's 29 energy projects under CPEC, 9 of which are coal, adding up to at least 7,500 megawatts. About 5,000 megawatts are already on the grid in the pipeline. Also under CPEC, sorry, I think I've just had, can you see my slides now? I think they were frozen.
Yeah, so we can see the coal-fired power, the mining slides with the trucks.
I've gone on to the next one now. Is that showing? No.
Not for us yet, no.
Right.
Oh, here it goes. There it is.
Yeah.
Sorry,
Okay. I'm sorry. I don't know what this.
We're just getting a little lag
sorry,
here.
it's South
London,
London.
it's far away. Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. Okay. So hopefully you're seeing my second slide. So this is showing the how the energy investments are dominated by coal. There's about 60% of energy investment going into coal. You can see here I've put a screenshot of an interactive map we created showing all the energy projects under CPEC, including some of the newer announcements of large hydropower in the north. In the middle of the country, there's also an open cast mine being developed, which is the world's largest deposit of lignite mining, a lignite coal, which is a particularly dirty kind of coal due to its high levels of carbon emissions. Also showing here a little chart with a breakdown of energy capacity from Green Innovation Hub, which is a Beijing-based NGO. The left-hand column, the largest one, showing coal, middle hydropower, and then the smaller share of renewables. Okay, so hopefully it's gone smoothly onto my next slides. So this is not painting a picture of CPEC as a poster child of China's Belt and Road Initiative, as it is like to, you know, Chinese policies makers like to portray. There's a number of obviously local kind of more local issues in Pakistan of immediate pollution. You know, in a country which is already suffering from very high levels of pollution and with some of the most polluted cities in the world. There's, as Atika mentioned, there's a report this year out by the National Commission for Human Rights, highlighting some of the local environmental issues of coal plants in the Thar Desert, you know, kind of expected things of water pollution, dust pollution, loss of wildlife habitat, and land violation of land acquisition laws. Analysts also argue that these coal projects are locking Pakistan into a high carbon emissions pathway. Some Pakistani experts have been vocal. Environmental lawyer Raphael Am, who's known not to mince his words, has described CPEC plans as ecocide. And this is for a country that's already feeling the intense impacts of climate change, with melting glaciers in the Himalayas, and issues of drought, groundwater depletion, and kind of saltwater level rise and intrusion down in the delta. Coal doesn't make economic sense for the country. It's far more expensive than solar and renewables, and Chinese state-owned enterprises have secured lucrative deals on their power purchase agreements, which means that Pakistan's ended up paying for very expensive electricity, and has kind of increased problems around circular debt in the power industry. An IEFA report this year, earlier this year, has kind of put Pakistan on track to actually face overcapacity of energy now by 2020. And so while Pakistan has turned to China asking for easier repayment terms on CPEC, existing coal power plants are already standing idle. These commitments, these energy projects under CPEC also don't fit with Pakistan's own green policies, including its kind of alternative energy policy that's come into law this year, which commits to 30% of energy mix from renewables, up from 4% now. And then finally, these, you know, the CPEC energy projects, they jar with China's rhetoric, increasing rhetoric around greening the Belt and Road Initiative. which we'll talk a little bit more about later. There are some renewable projects under CPEC, and I'm showing here some slides linking to our previous reporting. Notably, there's the big solar power plant in Punjab, 400 megawatts being built, and this will grow to a 1,000 megawatt plant. There have been positive benefits for locals from this plant. I think in a recent interview, one member was saying that our land community member has said our land has gone from 0 to hero since the solar power plant has come along. Wind power again, there's a sprinkling of wind power projects, but there are problems getting some of this energy onto the main grid and problem with the transmission lines required. There's a big question about, when you're talking about green energy, do you count big dams in that category, given the environmental impacts of construction and then the longer term impacts on kind of downstream flow of the water and sediment. But big hydro is a big part of Pakistan's plans to build up its renewable energy in the future, many funded by China, and this will continue to be a very controversial debate. Some of the larger dams planned upstream on the Indus will also be in very earthquake prone areas, which means that there could be, there could be a disaster and dam collapse that could cause massive damage downstream. So then I just wanted to talk, and I think that Yan will talk a little bit more in her presentation about the obstacles to ramping up renewables. So, why is, the world is changing, and there's a realization that we need to move away from coal. Is Chinese money and other finance continuing to move into these big projects? And I think under CPEC, the CPEC framework is very much set up as a government to government kind of framework, and facilitated by state-owned enterprises in China, whose experience there are in fossil fuels and coal. Whereas renewable companies are often smaller private firms, they don't have the same access to finance and to kind of state insurance companies like Sinosure, and this makes it quite difficult for them to move into new, sometimes kind of volatile, risky areas. There's also, clearly has been historically a preference for coal from Pakistan policymakers as a kind of seen as the only, the best way to get over immediate energy shortages. And then finally, these trends and these obstacles for renewable energy can be seen throughout BRI countries and in the trends that we're seeing in energy investments there. To end on a kind of, some optimistic notes as well for what the future can hold. Obviously, some of these, a lot of these big coal power projects in Pakistan have gone ahead. There are a number that have already been cancelled because, investors, developers have pulled out for financial reasons. But there is also a kind of a wider movement and a momentum against coal that we're seeing. For example, in Bangladesh recently, the government have said that I think now about only 4 of maybe 28 odd coal power projects are going to go ahead now because investors have pulled out. The finances no longer make sense. And although it was an environmental issue, reasons behind this, we can see a kind of bigger momentum here. And I think as China makes its commitment to become carbon neutral by 2060 domestically, I think people will be looking to see whether China will bring in stronger regulations for its overseas investment. At the moment, there are guidelines for kind of BRI investments, and these are all voluntary. But there is a movement to try and shift this in the future. Just recently, the Ministry of Ecology and Environment in China is coming out with a traffic light system to rate BRI investments in terms of how environmentally friendly they are. Obviously, they're not going to go back and retrograde their CPEC investments as, you know, big, bad and red, but this is for future investments and it's a positive movement going forward. I think what China Dialogue and what Third Pole will be doing will be looking at the kind of gap between high-level policy commitments and what's happening on the ground in places like Pakistan, and that's what we hope to kind of keep investigating and illuminating. So thank you very much. I'll hand over to our next presenter.
Thanks so much. And I really appreciate how you do the high policy and getting your boots on the ground. And speaking of boots on the ground, Yan, you could put your screen on and toss up your PowerPoint, because your boots have been on the ground in Pakistan, looking into some of the energy issues. So please toss up your slides. And just to remind the people in the audience, I'm already seeing on my second screen here that I'm getting some Twitter questions and questions on email. Keep them coming in. And please, you can start, Yan.
Thanks. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you, and you can share your screen.
I will share my screen later.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I think Beth and Atika have given a really overall picture and the latest trends about CPEC. And I will share some of my field experience to Pakistan last year. And in the field trip, I, with my colleagues, visited the CPEC coal plant, which was invested, built, and operated by Chinese companies, and also financed by a Chinese bank. And we lived there for 2 nights and got the chance to interview the Chinese and Pakistani workers living there. That trip was also my first time to Pakistan. So there were 2 things I think that struck me the most during the trip. So I will show you some pictures about the trip. Let me share my screen. Can you see my screen?
Yep, it's up. Thank you.
Okay. The 2 things I want to share, 2 things that struck me the most. One is I found that due to some security reasons, the plant was safeguarded by Pakistani side. So Chinese workers were not allowed to go in and out of the plant as they wanted. It may be good for their security because Pakistan, when we visited, was in tensions due to some military and geopolitical reasons. But indeed, it caused some inconvenience and created a sense of disconnection and mystery, as you can see from the slides. And I think this kind of disconnection was not good for Chinese to communicate and engage with the local communities living there. And the other thing that struck me was I found there was a distinct comparison between the plant and the nearby environment, which you can see from the slides that we visited a village near the coal power plant. You can see that the coal power plant looks so well established, and it also hires the local people with a relatively good payment. But the community nearby was poor. And I think most of them still lived on agriculture and pastures. There were also household bricks making factories in that village, which were also some causes for the local air pollution. So when I was in Pakistan and lived in the coal plant, I was thinking there may be other areas that the 2 countries can cooperate, like fighting air pollution, because in China, air pollution is the one decisive role in curbing new coal power. And also cooperating, like increasing environmental monitoring system and improving environmental regulations, because those can help push investors and operators there to raise their environmental performance. So with these kind of feelings and thinkings, we also try to explore why coal triumphed over other energy types during that time. So I show you the timeline in the slide, that you can see that actually developing coal power was initiated even before the idea of BRI or CPEC. Before 2013, Pakistan's power system was entangled with problems of severe power shortage, high generation costs, and circular debt. I think Beth also touched that problem in her presentation. So coal became the solution to this problem. Pakistan government want to use coal to replace expensive oil and gas imported from overseas. And Pakistan also has abundant coal reserves. But since 2013, there has been a shrinking trend of co-finance from international financiers. Thus, when BRI or CPEC was initiated, it became an opportunity for Pakistan to use that as a window to achieve its power development goals. And to attract investors, Pakistan government even offered good commercial conditions for coal power investors during 2013 to 2016 these years, with mechanisms called upfront tariff and take-or-pay contracts in the PPA, which is called power purchase agreements. And upfront tariff will ease investors' administrative burden if they agree with the tariff and technical requirements preset by the government. And Pakistan's NEPRA, which oversees Pakistan's electricity market, adjusted the tariff structure in 2014, I think, for coal power to make coal even more attractive for foreign investors. And besides, take-or-pay contract can even further help investors lock in their investment returns at an ideal rate for them. And Pakistan government will also offered guarantee for coal power on the CPEC project. So these mechanisms combined to contribute to the coal fever, but renewables during that time were not given the same privilege as coal. Renewables were not as competitive as coal in terms of the generation cost during that time. But now I think the situation is quite different. I think Beth also mentioned that there is a tendency of power surplus in Pakistan. And from the latest data, we also see that coal power is losing the advantage over renewables in terms of the cost. And Pakistan is also making the new renewables targets. So I think maybe in 2013, climate change or environmental issues were fringe topic in CPEC negotiation process compared to the urgent need to quickly fill in the power gap and ease poverty. But now, I think as CPEC continues, the two countries plan to cooperate in more infrastructure projects and several special economic zones. I believe both sides should draw experience from before and spend more time and attention in feasibility studies and project design to make the project more plausible and greener, and to incorporate long-term issues like climate change, environmental and ecological risks into decision making. And they should also try to increase transparency and to mitigate the skepticism or criticism from the local people towards China's investment, and create channels and platforms to help information disclosure and to foster the communication with affected communities. Yeah, so thanks. I will give my time to Jennifer.
Well, you don't want to give me time on this. I'm not the Pakistan energy expert, but I can usher people through. So we're going to giving a wave to Michael Kugelman to wrap us up here. I'm getting more questions in, and I'll be asking the questions as we go. And I have a bunch of my own, and you can also jump in later with questions. But for now, Michael, you are now a panelist. Please tell us what your story is.
Well, thanks a lot, Jennifer. I'm very grateful to be included in this discussion about a very timely and important topic, and I've really enjoyed learning from my fellow panelists over the last 30 minutes. So as was mentioned before, I manage the South Asia portfolio at the Wilson Center, including Pakistan. And what I think sets our work on Pakistan apart from that of other think tank shops in town is that we apply a broad lens to Pakistan that goes beyond hard security issues. So we've done a lot of work on non-security challenges, including energy security issues. So I'm really happy to be a part of this discussion. I think that my role is to sort of step back and place this discussion in a broader context in Pakistan. And I'm going to do that by highlighting some of the struggles that CPEC has faced of late. I think it's important to highlight these struggles because the losses in momentum that CPEC has experienced in recent months, I think further compound the challenges of integrating clean energy into CPEC, despite the progress in doing so, which has been described. And I'll explain what I mean by that. And I'll be boring, I won't do any screen sharing. The CPEC project has certainly slowed to a considerable degree. And I think the best way to measure that is through the lack of progress on specific CPEC initiatives. Originally, we were hearing all this talk of a $62 billion transport corridor project that would involve well more than 100 projects. Well, there was a study that was released earlier this year by the CSIS think tank that showed that only about a quarter of 122 announced CPEC projects valued at around $20 billion had been completed. And there are a number of reasons for this slowdown in CPEC's progress. We can cover this in detail in a discussion if we'd like. But I think certainly a main reason why is economic. Pakistan has been experiencing some considerable economic stress in recent years, including a balance of payments crisis, and more recently, some of the worst inflation that it's seen in more than a decade. Its latest IMF package will mandate austerity. So the economy's hands are tied to a degree, limiting Islamabad's ability to commit to new Chinese loans and therefore to new CPEC projects. So Pakistan really has to be cautious moving forward. And I think there are certainly some political factors at play. CPEC has had for a long time been associated with the previous Pakistani government because as was mentioned earlier, it was when the prior government was in power in 2015 when CPEC was formally launched. And the current government in Pakistan, led by Prime Minister Imran Khan, which took office in 2018, has always had somewhat of an awkward relationship with CPEC. Certainly the current government is fully behind CPEC. It supports it, it's committed to it. But Imran Khan, going back to his earliest days as an opposition politician, as an opposition leader, has long pursued a singular cause of anti-corruption and transparency. And that still is one of his main focuses now as prime minister. So therefore, the highly opaque CPEC is, I think, a bit politically inconvenient for Khan and his party. And also politically inconvenient to Khan are the corruption allegations that were recently made against the head of the CPEC authority that were published by a Pakistani journalist earlier this year. And then there was also a report published by a Pakistani government commission earlier this year that found that Chinese independent power generating projects in Pakistan are mired in corruption. That was also politically inconvenient for the current government. Despite all this, clearly CPEC continues to be a priority for the civilian leadership in Pakistan, as well as its military, which is the most powerful political player in Pakistan, and which has also been Beijing's preferred interlocutor in its CPEC engagements, especially since the Khan government took office. So why does CPEC remain a priority for Pakistan? Well, it remains a flagship project of the Belt and Road Initiative, the most fully operationalized dimension of the project, and it therefore constitutes a key strategic priority for China, arguably Pakistan's most important partner. And I would argue as well that the importance of CPEC for Pakistan and China has soared ever since November 2019, when the US government, for the first time ever, expressed public formal opposition to CPEC and BRI. And that's when Alice Wells, who at the time was the top South Asia official at the State Department, she lambasted CPEC and the investment model that accompanies it during a speech at the Wilson Center, in fact. So there's a heightened desire, I think, to champion CPEC and to double down on it from the perspective of both Islamabad and Beijing. And in that regard, it's critical that Pakistan and China not be perceived as caving into pressure from the US government to rein it in. And this brings me to the clean energy bit to this story. Visible progress with CPEC is very important now for Pakistan and China. There need to be indications that things are still moving forward in order to push back against not only criticism from the US government, but also to push back against these perceptions, which are accurate, of a slowdown and losses in momentum. And there's always been a very strong state-propagated and state-sponsored narrative in Pakistan that CPEC is essentially the greatest thing since sliced bread, and that it's going to strengthen China-Pakistan partnership and, more importantly, bring greater prosperity to Pakistan through creating more employment, more infrastructure, more trade, and so on. And those that speak out publicly against CPEC in Pakistan are oftentimes shouted down. The simple truth is that the way the Pakistani state would like this issue to be seen, CPEC is meant to be viewed as sacrosanct. So in that regard, to show that CPEC is continuing to enjoy successes despite its challenges and its slowdowns, and in order to buttress this strong narrative of success and progress, Beijing and Islamabad will want to focus on what they know can work, the relatively low-hanging fruit, and that entails focusing on the CPEC projects that have already been started, and also trying to build out the special economic zones that constitute the major focus of the second phase. And by contrast, the challenges of integrating clean energy projects into CPEC, as we've heard just now, are notable. And so I think that from the perspective of Beijing and Islamabad, this is not the time to be trying to get too ambitious, despite the very genuine desire of the current Pakistani government to make clean energy a bigger part of its energy mix. I think what might be more realistic in the future is to see over the longer term Chinese support for Pakistani solar and wind projects or other clean energy initiatives that take place outside of the CPEC enterprise. So I think that the bottom line is that CPEC is at this point considered to be too big to fail from Islamabad's perspective, and it's simply not the right time to be focusing on implementing clean energy projects on a large scale, given that this would constitute a lift that's too heavy for Beijing and Islamabad to bear right now. And this isn't to say that CPEC itself is imperiled or anything like that. I don't mean that. There have been a number of completed projects, albeit many that harm the environment, with plans for more. And I think there are several factors at play that could give CPEC a further boost. One is that the second phase of CPEC is now in full effect, with its emphasis on SEZs. This has also included the announcement this past summer of $11 billion in new deals, including a $7 billion renovation of Pakistan's railway infrastructure. And I think that geopolitics also work in CPEC's favor. A fatal and really nasty border standoff between China and India this year has plunged relations between those two countries to their lowest level in decades, which I think gives added incentive to Beijing and Islamabad to double down on a project bitterly opposed by New Delhi. And indeed, one of the new investments announced this summer entails nearly $4 billion in hydropower projects in Pakistan-administered Kashmir, which is a region claimed by India. But to conclude, despite these positive signs for CPEC, given the slowdown that's facing, it's going to be important for Pakistan and China to prioritize the aspects of CPEC that have the greatest chance of yielding relatively quick and visible progress. And I think that difficult clean energy projects simply don't make the cut. So thank you very much and look forward to a discussion.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, it's like I'm torn. Good, bad. Yeah, there's a little tension here on what it's hard. I guess our title was right. It's hard to be green. It's not easy being green. So I've started to get some questions coming in. Some are very specific in energy. Some are gloriously broad. I guess let's start with like a narrowish one that kind of caught my eye too. Is that I think, Beth, you talked about the Chinese Ministry of Ecological Environment has this new color-coded rating system. I thought the stoplight. I assume green is good, right? Greens, yeah. And you know, for the BRI projects. And so it's going to focus on the climate, pollution, and biodiversity impacts. Do you think that Beth, do you think that this will be something that will help us see real progress on lessening BRI's environmental, damaging environmental impact? Do you think the MEE move could mark the beginning of a green CPEC or green BRI? And that question comes from Yifei Li from he's a professor at New York University in Shanghai, and he spoke for me a couple months ago. So what do you think? Is this whole beep beep, the stoplight system, you think it's gonna yield some results? Does it have potential, Beth?
Well, I mean, greening the BRI is a kind of official, a Chinese official kind of a project, and I think that the rhetoric is kind of been growing and growing. I think it's definitely a positive step, and it shows how seriously things are being taken at the top level. I mean, what's happened in the past is that there have been, as I said, there have been guidelines issued for Chinese lenders and for overseas investors, but they are voluntary and there's no penalties. So I think I think it's a very positive step, and I think it will raise awareness and make people think more about the kind of impact that projects are having. But it remains to be seen whether it will have a real impact until there's some kind of enforcement mechanism, kind of bite, I guess, to these kind of policies.
And I just want to add on, kind of, for me, kind of both a top-down, bottom-up query on this. Is there, I mean, are we seeing that, I mean, there's a lot of talk on green BRI, but have we seen specifically, is there any kind of roadmap about phasing out overseas coal investments in BRI? I mean, the Japanese have decided they're not going to do it. Is there any inklings of that, or is it still, it seems like, are they still sticking to like, coal is needed, it's what Pakistan and these other countries want? So that's the top-down question. The other one is, I mean, I know that there are some and international and Chinese NGOs that are trying to kind of being kind of watchdogs or being advisors, making suggestions. Do you see some kind of promising changes coming from that kind of bottom-up pressure as well?
Yeah, I'll give this a quick answer, and then maybe Yen would like to say something as well on this, I think. Yeah, so I don't think there are any kind of concrete plans as such now. I don't think we can expect that overnight for China to suddenly say, no, we're definitely not be funding any overseas coal. But I think there's a kind of starting to try and change the levers. And I think that I think that the domestic goal for carbon emissions neutrality has kind of raised these big questions of, okay, fine, but what about overseas investment? Because if you're thinking about tackling global climate change, you have to think of the bigger picture. And I think that pressure and demand is going to grow from within China and outside. And there's the wider economic shifts as well away from fossil fuels. So I hope this will all start to gather pace. But maybe Yen can talk more specifically about what she feels is happening within China on this.
Yeah, I can share some of my observations both from the top down and the bottom up. I think President Xi's carbon neutrality goal sends a really powerful and positive signal to both Chinese financial institutions and companies in investing or participating in new coal or fossil fuel projects overseas. Despite that kind of goal hasn't been translated into some mandatory standards or policies right now, but we do see that recently some policies has touched the overseas coal issue in recent policies that we see China release the first climate financing regulations, and in that regulation there has been some words touching on the high quality overseas projects, and the ministries want to use the carbon as a signal to reduce the new coal power. I think that's the big trend from the policies to interpret the goal, to interpret the carbon neutrality goal into policies. And from bottom up, as I've communicated and talked with some people working in this area, I do feel that they they have knew the financial risks and operational risks in overseas coal projects. So they have been more wary of the risks and be more conscious of the new investment in overseas. I think that will be a good trend. And the environmental and climate risks should be more interpreted into their both companies and the banks' financial models or operational models to be incorporated as their indexes when they make the decision. Yeah.
Thanks for that. I also, I'm also kind of curious because Yan Wang and some others have also mentioned about, kind of, I mean, besides Yan Wang, I was struck how you did make the observation that, both China and Pakistan face a lot of pollution problems. And China currently has a war on pollution going on, and has, but we are sometimes, well, I haven't been there in a little while, but we are tending to see more blue skies in Beijing. And wondering about, I mean, I know we're talking about clean energy, but again, when you have strong air pollution control policy, that also starts creating the kind of incentives you need. So I was kind of curious, have any of you on the panel seen any kind of dialogue between China and Pakistan on issues of pollution, air quality? Also curious about energy efficiency. I mean, China, talk about, a low-hanging fruit that China just totally picked and is now working its way up the tree. I mean, China's made a lot of progress on promoting energy efficiency in buildings. Also, vehicle standards. I was kind of curious, in the CPEC, is there any kind of mechanism or opportunity to get this kind of information sharing? So it's not hard infrastructure. Sometimes it's more kind of on the policy side. I toss it out to anyone who wants to grab that.
I'll jump in first, just on the kind of pollution side. I mean, I think like in Pakistan, that the monitoring of pollution levels is so poor. I think it may be even Yen that told me this, but that there's monitoring stations at some of the Chinese power plants, digital real-time monitoring of air pollution levels. But the Pakistan government, the local government, don't actually have the means to read these pollution levels, and so they note it down all on a piece of paper, and then it kind of goes to the ministry and out to the people that way. So I mean, I think there'd be a lot of opportunity to kind of work and learn, about how to better kind of monitor and mobilize people around these issues from the Chinese experience, definitely.
No, that's really insightful, because I know for years, I mean, over the years, I've had people like from the US EPA and others come and talk about all this work that they did working with coal plants to improve the monitoring systems, to, again, make things digital. And now in China, I mean, we all know since 2014 that all cities have to have live, air pollution, reports. I mean, and the public can access this and people criticize it. And so so I kind of see that that's a big success in China, and it'd be lovely to see how can we get that on the Belt and Road. Does someone else have some comments about some of my other queries about energy efficiency, pollution control? I mean, yeah, go ahead, Atika.
I just wanted to add something quickly to what Beth said regarding pollution in Pakistan. So she's absolutely right about there being very weak monitoring mechanisms. And I think there's a growing pressure from citizens and from activists to install better air quality monitors. There have been private initiatives to install these monitors, but the readings on these monitors are incredibly high and totally different from what the government monitors are saying. So I'm not sure what level the Chinese and Pakistan governments are discussing this, but the conversation in Pakistan is growing, especially because of a respiratory illness like COVID. This conversation is going to grow bigger.
Michael, just throwing you one from left field here. I got to thinking back in 2012, 2013, I don't know if you know the story, that the US Embassy put monitors on their rooftops and they broadcast what the air quality was. And I know they've done that on the embassies in India. Do we know if the US Embassy in Pakistan has done the same? I mean, I think it's become kind of a worldwide practice. Do we do that? Does the US Embassy do that in Pakistan? Do you know?
I'm not sure. I think, yeah, it may, I definitely know it happens in India, but yeah, that would make sense that it would happen in Pakistan too. I don't know for sure. Maybe Atika says that it is happening. It would make sense to do.
Yeah, I think it definitely, I think I have seen something on social media, and I think I have seen their social media accounts talk about the air quality. But what usually happens with, I mean, I don't see the Pakistan government openly contesting the US embassy's air quality monitor, but what they do with the private air quality monitor, like initiatives by citizens, is that they, you know, find excuses for how, I mean, they say that these monitors are installed too close to factories, for example, and they're not really very accurately measuring the levels of pollution. But yeah, that's an interesting question. I have to look into that.
Yeah,
You know, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No,
I was just going to, just to add on to this, I think it's important to emphasize, which I sort of referenced in my comments, that there is a genuine commitment in Pakistan to tackle these issues. Pollution, certainly, in terms of, you know, pressure from civil society and so on, but the broader issue of climate change and mitigating emissions, there is a genuine commitment. And I think that the big challenge is, you know, it's easy to pass a law, but implementing it and enforcing is a lot more difficult. But you know, Pakistan launched a national climate change policy about 7 years ago, I think, and it had an accompanying implementation framework. And then a few years after it was launched, there actually was a court case, a high court judge in Lahore, one of the major cities in Pakistan. He actually issued a ruling in which he ordered the Pakistani government to do more to enforce the climate change adaptation measures that were articulated in the national climate change policy. Apparently a farmer had been unhappy that climate change was affecting his livelihood. It got to the courts. So that was very encouraging. It was a number of years ago, at any rate. But you know, there had been some things done. There have been some efforts on the part of the government to try to make it easier for solar and wind to achieve, to try to get to greater scale, to face a friendlier market. But you know, at the end of the day, you do run into this problem of passing new laws instead of trying to enforce existing ones. And a lot of environmental activists and analysts have pointed out as well too. But I just think it's important to emphasize that, you know, this is not an issue that Pakistan is completely ignoring. And certainly, as Atika mentioned, because of the increasing public health risks of growing pollution, that's something that certainly has the government's attention.
Atika, you mentioned, well, some of you have talked about how that, you know, in the next phase, the special economic zones and maybe more the railroads are going to get built out. Are there any plans, maybe, I don't know if Atika or someone could talk about, what about the power transmission lines? I mean, China has some of the fastest, the biggest. How many superlatives can you put on it? I mean, China moves a lot of electricity through these ultra fast transmission lines in China. Is that part of the mix that in some of the future investment? Because I mean, because if you want to get renewables, and you're going to build all these big farms, solar and wind farms, you got to get it to the cities. Or maybe
yeah, I can jump in there. So I think under the kind of the CPEC official projects, there's one transmission line out of everything. So no, it's not been a big focus, and yes, it should be more of a focus. But there has also, I mean, there has been, I know there's some kind of exchanges between China and Pakistan, engineers and policymakers looking to learn from some of the high-speed transmission lines that China's built from, you know, flowing from the west to the east. So I think there are some exchanges, but that's not reflected yet into the kind of CPEC official projects.
Beth or someone, would it be easier if Pakistan, instead of focusing, you know, there's you guys talked about the big solar farms. In fact, I got a question. Someone wrote, let's see, John Hedger, a retired federal government official, wrote, I hope I can say this right. I'm sorry. Balochistan he thinks is excellent for solar arrays. Is this part of the energy mix? So you mentioned like the Punjab, are there other plans for other big solar farms? But I guess my question is, what about decentralized solar, rooftop, closer to the consumer? Is that, I don't know, that would seem, because Michael, you said that they want to get things done that show quick results. And in my mind, building more rooftop solar that gets the energy right to the people right away could show results maybe a little faster than these big solar and wind farms. Anyone can take that.
Well, no, I mean, I think that it's hard to say. I mean, clearly, I mean, in terms of that question that you posed, solar is not a big part of the mix. And as was mentioned several times, the government has very ambitious objectives of making renewable energy 30% of the electricity mix, which is clearly not going to happen. I think the current figure is 3 or 4%, something like that. Another problem, Baluchistan specifically is very sensitive because indeed, I mean, there are big plans to do CPEC activities there, particularly the port in Gwadar, which is viewed as one of the linchpins of CPEC to develop that more. But as was mentioned before, there hasn't been much progress. But Baluchistan is sensitive because you know, it's the home to a long-standing separatist insurgency that has long opposed Pakistani development efforts, which separatists and those that support them claim that it's something that's meant to exploit local resources inequitably. And so CPEC has been heavily opposed in Baluchistan by many there, particularly those that support the insurgency, just because they view it as essentially an expansion of these longstanding Pakistani state efforts to essentially rob the resource, particularly the very rich natural gas resources. So anything that's intended to be done in Baluchistan could inherently run into some obstacles. And this gets to the broader issues that I think may have been discussed earlier, that, you know, the several provinces, Baluchistan, particularly Baluchistan, are very concerned that the benefits of CPEC will essentially be disproportionately focused on Punjab, and to a lesser extent, maybe KPK, but Baluchistan is a really tricky place. So it's ironic because the conditions, I mean, the weather conditions are very conducive for harnessing solar energy and wind energy, but it's just very difficult to do that given the political realities of the region.
Thank you for that, Beth.
Yeah, no, I say it's a good point about, you know, this issue of, you know, what's needed, you know, large scale solar or kind of smaller distributed, because I think, you know, outside of CPEC, there is a lot of small scale solar going up in Pakistan, often, you know, funded by individuals. You know, sometimes individuals in poorer neighborhoods in cities who don't have access to the main grid. And so, you know, I guess finding ways to channel money and support to those kind of initiatives could be very positive.
Great. Actually, while I have you here, Beth, yeah, you didn't, when you did your intro, you didn't note, but you kind of hinted at, but a lot of your work over the years with China Dialogue and Third Pole Initiative has focused on China's international rivers. You're a water person. And I was curious in Pakistan, you know, because I've done a lot of work on the water energy nexus. You know, coal is can be very water intensive in terms of washing and cooling. In terms of the Chinese energy investments in coal and otherwise, is there, are there any water footprint challenges?
In terms of the energy investment, I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, that's actually, I mean, it's something that there was so much to kind of try and cover in a short period. I didn't even touch on, you know, the kind of water crunch situation of coal. So obviously coal is, you know, one of the most water intensive ways to generate electricity. And the areas where this is being done in Pakistan are areas where drought is a, you know, growing issue, where water shortages are acute. You know, particularly in places like the Thar Desert. And it is not something that has been factored into energy plans, as I'm aware of, in Pakistan at all. And then obviously there's issues around, you know, the big dams that are planned and have come up, particularly on the upper Indus River. And the issues there, you know, the size of these dams will mean that they will change the kind of the way that the water and silt flows down, affecting Sindh, Punjab, right down to the delta. You know, in places like the Ganges Basin, you know, building large-scale cascade dams has actually seriously reduced the amount of sediment reaching the delta and having a big impact on farmers and increasing sea level rise and subsidence. So yeah, there's a huge amount of kind of interconnected issues to think about here.
And there's just to cut in briefly, there's long been a debate in Pakistan about the merits of large dams versus smaller ones. And the current government clearly is in favor of these larger dams, as previous ones have been as well. Just because I think that for the government, if you could build a large dam, you know, it's sort of a very visible manifestation of water generation. So it has political value, so to speak. Whereas if you focus on the smaller scale water generation projects, it's not as easy to point to them politically as a success story. And I think also the whole India-Pakistan rivalry gets drawn into this, that you know, Pakistan claims that India has been violating the Indus Waters Treaty and preventing water from flowing downstream to Pakistan. So it's important for Pakistan to do whatever is necessary to ensure that there's sufficient water. But here is where civil society, I think, has been very, well, not successful, but active and successful to a degree in pushing back against this idea of big dams. You've got some very prominent environmental activists, including Rafi Alam, who was mentioned before, who you cited in your reportage, Beth and Atika, who has been a very strong voice on the dangers of dams. Kaiser Bengali is someone else. So it's been an ongoing debate, and it's not going to end anytime soon. But you know, as Pakistan's water security continues to get worse, I think that debate will only become more sharp.
Thank you. And yeah, I've got another question that came in, but Michael, also, if there's some questions that you have for the panelists too, do you want to jump in with one, or I'll ask this one question, you think of one, all right? Anthony Frank from American University wrote, recently mentioned on China Daily, the Belt and Road Initiative has boosted sales of electric vehicles with an increase in trade activities and infrastructure investments. So I think was asking broadly, but I was curious about, I want to make it more Pakistan. It says, what are the developmental and systematic hurdles in policies concerning the construction and use of charging station and EVs in Pakistan? Are electric vehicles even, are they on the menu yet for CPEC cooperation?
Oh,
go ahead, Beth.
Sure. I don't know a lot about electric vehicle policy in Pakistan, but I don't think it's on the cards for CPEC. But I think there was a new policy introduced at the end of December last year that was aiming to kind of boost electric vehicles, a very kind of ambitious policy, you know, as part of, because, you know, we've been talking about pollution a lot, and actually I think the major sources of pollution in Pakistan cities, you know, aren't coal. It is more issues around, you know, congestion and vehicles in cities which don't have, like, you know, don't have a struggle to have, you know, build mass public transport. So I think this will be a very important element. And maybe Atika can talk a little bit more about the kind of how electric vehicles are taking off or not taking off in Pakistan.
Thanks, Beth. Yeah, I think the policy is very ambitious, and I think they plan to roll it out for hybrid buses and rickshaws and bikes. But I think the problem is, where will Pakistan find the money for these projects? I mean, we're talking about very, very expensive projects, and Pakistan's already struggling with the financing aspect of CPEC projects. And with the IMF loan restrictions, there's a cap on how much Pakistan can borrow for certain CPEC projects. So money is definitely going to be a challenge. And there's also the issue of lobbyists. I mean, what incentives are we going to give to people to switch over from regular vehicles to electric vehicles? So those are the two major challenges that I can foresee.
Jennifer, should I pose a question now? Excellent, thanks. So I like to be a comparativist, and I always try to look at you know, other cases, other country cases that can enhance thinking about any particular place. So I guess a question for for Beth and Yan, but really whoever wants to respond to it, is can we look to other examples of Chinese investment in clean energy in other countries that have been successful? If so, you know, where is this, and could they offer any potential lessons for making it easier to do better things with clean energy in Pakistan, not just not just within the CPEC rubric, but more broadly as well? Just curious if anyone had any thoughts on that. maybe not. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Some example just bumping to my head that maybe just recent years, many Chinese companies went overseas market to try many cooperation forms to for renewable projects, not only green investment but also merger and acquisition. And these kind of direct investment, I think, especially in some European countries, I think it's a good opportunity for Chinese companies to merge into the local market, as well as learning some best practice to how to operate a project and with higher standards from zero. So I think by this kind of cooperation, Chinese can know more local standards rather than just dealing with the local government. And other cases like some Chinese companies have realized the importance of communicating with the local community. So they start to publish information, create some social account, and hold some local community engagement. I think that's a good start, but still how to communicate in some right ways, they still have to climb the learning curve, I think.
That was a good comment, because I was struck when you spoke, Yan, that how the Chinese workers really weren't even communicating that well with, they weren't engaged in the local community. The project really was just more government to government, and then the investment went in. One of my comments for you, Michael, if I can jump in, electric vehicles. We've seen that some Chinese companies, and again, this is more just free market. It's not, they often maybe get called BRI. You have to understand that BRI is not a monolith and planned minutely by Beijing, but you've got, electric buses are being put in a number of countries in Latin America. I think it was Peru is one, hopefully I have that right, but it's an example where a private company goes in and does, like Yanwang was saying, they kind of figure out how to find partners in that country to make electric buses work, because you can't just, that's not a top-down project. And that, I find that really encouraging. And I would really like to see, in China, they're also still struggling with some distributed, you are seeing more distributed power in China in terms of like rooftop solar, but also even in rural China, we're having distributed off-grid renewables. And those are kinds of models that I would love to see, like, and again, I have no secret plan how they do it, but that would be great kind of projects to get on the Belt and Road, and to projects like CPEC. You mentioned, it's been said a couple of times that Pakistan is now is overcapacity in terms of energy, but so can someone help me correct? But isn't Pakistan still need electricity? Not everyone's on the grid, right? So that was.
I think the question, the issue is getting it to where it's needed, and kind of, the questions around energy efficiency and transmission lines. I think that's the issue here. Just to go back to the question of learning, seeing what's happening in other places and what Pakistan could learn, or what would be interesting experience. I think in terms of China's kind of renewable investments, Southeast Asia is a very interesting place to look, where there is more money kind of flowing now into renewable projects. Obviously, if you're looking at the bigger picture, money, particularly from policy and development banks, is still fossil fuel kind of directed. But there are these big projects. But the issue is, so to take Myanmar for an example, where there is now a huge presence in the solar sector there from China, the tendency, because of what the government is tendering and putting out, the projects that are coming up are these larger solar projects, rather than the kind of distributed solar projects that would actually help poorer people get onto grids. So I think it's not even just renewables, fossil fuels. It's actually looking at what kind of projects are being funded, and who's benefiting from them, really.
Yeah, just to add in here, I think that Beth hit a really key point earlier, that the transmission distribution issues are huge. And, you know, if you look at energy issues, energy security in Pakistan over time, it seems like there are always several key challenges that are always there and never appear to be resolved, no matter how many efforts any one government may appear to make. And one of them are these transmission and distribution losses. I mean, the supply is not as much, and many times the supply is not as much of a concern as the demand side management. You know, that entails energy infrastructure that's just not in good shape, things that are falling apart and so on. And that contributes to these longstanding losses in distribution and transmission. And obviously this is something that has an impact on water security as well. So I think that's really a core issue that it just seems like successive governments have never been able to crack that challenge.
We just have a few minutes left here, and I was kind of wondering, you know, I don't know if a big final question, where do you see things going? But maybe, so Atika, you started us off. You gave us the lay of the land, a little bit where it's going.
So yeah, thanks, Jennifer. I was just raising my hand to jump in and talk about something that Yan, Wang, and I were discussing before the seminar began. I mean, I was looking at her presentation and looking at the photos that she showed to all of us and wondering how did she have access to that as a journalist working in Pakistan and now working with the third pole on CPEC? It is so difficult to get access to CPEC projects. I mean, even basic questions such as how many Chinese contractors are working in Pakistan, how many Chinese citizens are working in Pakistan, even innocent stories like cultural stories about you know, the daily lives of the Chinese community in certain parts of the country. I mean, information is very, very hard to come by. So I think the future of CPEC, and we keep talking about where the project will go, becomes murkier, because if we don't have information, we have a hard time holding the government accountable for the environment. So I think that's a major problem that I foresee, and I don't see it getting better.
And my gut instinct too is that if there is a lack of transparency, that has to hurt the markets as well, because right, other investors might, you know, could look for opportunities to help accelerate some of these projects or do ancillary ones. This is not, it seems like it's kind of like they're creating a missed opportunity because people just don't know what's going on. Yeah,
Yeah, I just want to echo with Atika that it was also a struggle for me to put up with all the information about CPEC in China, because the information is also distributed and I have to take much time and energy into finding the sources I want. And from my experience that I found that environmental issues are quite a fringe when the government to government negotiate about CPEC. So like the environmental or the ministry that in charge of the environmental or climate issues were missing in the negotiation. So the priorities the priority will not give into these topics. But let's look back to China, that when Chinese government make regional development plans, they will usually do a strategic environmental assessment and make that information transparent to the public and to different ministries. And I think this kind of practice can be learned from the CPEC negotiation, like to make the projects more transparent and take environmental issues into consideration.
That's fabulous. And you know, speaking of transparency, the fact that all of you, and Michael included, I mean, you do research and put on meetings to help kind of shine a light on, you know, not always, we're not like we're just all watchdogs, but what's going on in terms of, you know, pushing forward kind of maybe a greener, cleaner agenda. And I want to thank all of you for the work that you're doing. And also thank you for coming here and joining us today and telling your stories for this webinar. It's not easy being green, but you guys pointed to, it wasn't all gloom and doom. We saw little hints of where things could go. And I really, again, I applaud the work that you're doing and I want to thank you all. And I think with that, we'll just wrap it up for the day. Thank you again.